My daughter-in-law forgot her cell phone on my kitchen counter that afternoon. I noticed it when I was wiping crumbs off the table. Sunlight sliding through the curtains like honey across the linoleum. The thing buzzed once, twice, then lit up. And right there on the screen was a photo that froze my blood. My husband. The same husband we'd buried 2 years ago. For a second, I thought maybe I was seeing things. I blinked, leaned closer. Nope. It was Frank, smiling that same easy grin, the one he wore in the picture we used for his memorial program. The caller ID said Frank, and before I even thought about it, my hand trembled toward the phone. The ringtone kept cutting through the quiet like a knife in silk. I didn't pick it up. I just watched it ring until it stopped. Then a notification popped up. One new message. The preview line read, "You miss me, doll." My breath caught. I should have left that phone right where it was. Should have waited for my daughter-in-law, Cheryl, to come back and collect it. But curiosity has teeth. And when the dead start texting, you don't just walk away. I tapped the screen. The message opened one single sentence staring back at me. "Don't tell her you know. He'll come for you next." My knees almost gave out. I grabbed the counter to steady myself, heart beating somewhere up in my throat. Now, before I go further, hit that subscribe button. Y'all, if you love a real-life story, that'll keep your heart racing. And please, comment the city you're watching from, 'cause I want to know just how far this kind of crazy travels. Anyway, back to that message. I reread it a dozen times, hoping I was misreading. Who was he? My husband? Someone pretending to be him? And what did they mean, come for me next? My first thought was maybe Cheryl was seeing another man, some creep using Frank's old pictures trying to mess with her. But the timestamp said the message came through barely 10 minutes ago. Whoever sent it knew the phone was in my house. I walked around, checking the windows. Everything looked normal. The only sound was the clock ticking above the stove, and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Still, I felt watched, like eyes were pressing against the back of my neck. When Cheryl finally pulled up in her shiny SUV, I slipped the phone into my sweater pocket. I wanted answers, but not yet. She came in all smiles, smelling like perfume and car air freshener, saying she'd just run out for milk. I told her I'd found her phone. Oh my God, thank you. She laughed, like she hadn't a care in the world, but her hand shook just a bit when she took it. "You get any calls?" I asked, casual. She blinked fast. Maybe spam. Why?" "Just wondering," I said, watching the color drain from her face. After she left, I stood at the window and watched her drive off, that phone clutched tight in her hand. My gut told me something ugly was twisting underneath her perfect daughter-in-law act. And if Frank was somehow tied up in this, dead or alive, I was gonna find out. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that ringtone in my head, kept seeing his picture glowing in the dark. I dug out my old photo albums, stared at his smile, trying to match them, and I buried with the one I saw on that screen. Frank had been pronounced dead after a boating accident. They'd said his body was never recovered, that the current probably carried him out past the bay. I'd cried till my ribs ached, accepted the folded flag and tried to move on. But now, I wasn't sure what to believe. The next morning I brewed my coffee and sat at the table staring at the empty chair across from me, the one where he used to read the paper. My phone buzzed. "Unknown number." Against every ounce of sense I had, I answered. A low voice said, "Stop asking questions, Margaret." Then silence. My mug slipped from my hands and shattered on the floor. Whoever that was knew my name, and they sure as hell knew I'd started digging. I called Cheryl. No answer. It tried again. Straight to voicemail. Something in me switched then. The part that used to make casseroles and smile through family dinners turned to steel. I wasn't gonna sit around scared in my own house. I grabbed my coat, got in my car, and drove to Frank's old storage unit by the marina, the one he kept locked even from me. The lease was still under his name. When the clerk saw my ID, he hesitated. but I spun a story about clearing out old junk for the estate. He handed me the key. Inside, the air smelled of dust and motor oil. I pulled the light chain, and there it was. His boat. Not wrecked, not sunken. Sitting there under a tarp like it had been waiting for him to come back any minute. And on the seat, a single photograph. Cheryl and Frank. Laughing together. Date stamped 6 months ago. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there, staring, every piece of my world shifting into place. He hadn't died. He'd lied. And he'd been living close enough to keep both of us fooled. I slipped the photo into my pocket, locked the door behind me, and walked out into the cold air, my mind already building a plan, not out of rage, but out of clarity. They thought I was a frail old widow who'd crumble if she found out the truth. They forgot that I'd built this family from nothing, that I'd survived worse storms than either of them could imagine. I wasn't going to scream or run to the cops. I was going to make them show themselves, and when they did, I'd be ready. I didn't go home that night. I drove aimlessly, gripping the photo of Frank and Cheryl like it was a lit fuse. My mind wasn't racing. It was calculating. Every laugh, every lie, every whispered promise they'd shared behind my back. It all lined up now. They thought I was done, fragile, broken, but they underestimated me. They always did. By morning, I had a plan forming. Not a reckless one, but a slow, precise unraveling. The kind that makes people squirm while they think they're in control. I brewed some strong coffee, pulled out a notebook, and wrote down everything I knew. Dates, places, interactions, little habits that only Frank and Cheryl would know. Every detail would be ammunition. First things first, I needed more proof. Something undeniable. Something that would make both of them realize Ick knew. And not in a casual, I saw a photo kind of way. I started with Cheryl's phone. She was careless sometimes. She left it unlocked. And I had learned own rule after a lifetime of handling people. Those who cheat, lie, or betray usually leave a breadcrumb trail. I waited until the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a person twitchy. I grabbed the phone from me sweater pocket, the one she'd forgotten, and scrolled. There it was. Messages, photos, little coded notes between her and Frank. Their excitement at keeping secrets, their arrogance at thinking I'd never catch on. I felt a shiver, but it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. I knew I had to be smart. Jumping straight in would alert them, make them hide, cover their tracks. No, I wanted the full picture. I wanted to expose everything. My revenge wouldn't just be a quick hit. It would be theatrical, unforgettable, and utterly humiliating for both of them. Over the next few days, I became a ghost in my own home. I kept my normal routines, smiled at neighbors, played the harmless grandmother role. But inside I was assembling a web. Every phone call, every meeting, every tiny slip by Cheryl or Frank. I noted it. I even contacted a few old friends who owed me favors. Quiet allies who could provide small details and confirmations. I was gathering the skeletons of a story that would bury them, and they wouldn't even see it coming. Then came the first little test. I sent Cheryl a cryptic text from a burner phone I'd bought online. I know everything. Meet me at the old cafe at 6. She called immediately, panic in her voice, asking if I'd lost my mind. I didn't answer. I wanted her nerves to fray, wanted to see her crack under pressure. Next, I started leaving subtle clues around the house, notes that only Cheryl or Frank could recognize, small hints that someone was watching, listening. She would glance over her shoulder. Frank would check his phone obsessively. I didn't need to say a word. Suspicion alone would make them reveal more. And reveal they did. Cheryl couldn't help herself. She started texting Frank more, paranoia creeping into every message. She bragged about how careful she was, how nothing could go wrong. But in doing so, she let me read between the lines. Every word, every emoji, every pause was a piece of the puzzle. I even started recording certain messages, just in case I needed physical proof later. Then came the perfect opening. I made it look like I was slipping, an old lady, confused, maybe about to trip. Cheryl rushed to check on me, panic painted all over her face. In doing so, she let a message pop up on her phone right in front of me. It was a plan they'd been plotting, a plan I hadn't known about. She didn't even notice that I snapped a photo of it with my own camera. Another layer added to my arsenal.
I realized that revenge isn't just about confrontation. It's about control. Making them believe they're untouchable, then systematically dismantling their sense of security. Frank, who thought he could fake death, thought he could manipulate me from the shadows, had no idea I was orchestrating a show that would leave them exposed. I decided it was time to push the stakes higher. I didn't need police involvement yet. I needed the humiliation, the psychological collapse. I set up a little dinner, supposedly a family gathering, with just a few trusted neighbors. Invitations went out quietly. Cheryl didn't know they'd be there. Frank didn't know they existed. Everyone would be a witness when the story came out. Meanwhile, I kept feeding small hints directly to Frank. I sent him an anonymous note. You can't hide forever. 2 years of lies end soon. The panic in his emails back to Cheryl was deliciously obvious. He started making mistakes. Phone calls at odd hours, leaving digital trails, slipping up in his lies. Every mistake became fuel for my plan. I even involved a few people from Frank's past, business partners, old friends who had suspected his schemes but lacked evidence. They were more than happy to confirm suspicions once I provided subtle prompts. I was building a narrative, one that would hit every vulnerability, every lie they'd relied on to feel safe. By the end of that week, I had enough to start pulling threads, enough to make them panic, enough to orchestrate the perfect reveal. And I hadn't even shown my hand yet. They were still dancing in the illusion that I was oblivious, that I'd never pieced together their betrayal. And all the while, I reminded myself why I was doing this. Not for revenge alone, but for closure, for justice, for the final proof that I wasn't a fool, and that betrayal, no matter how long hidden, eventually catches up. I set my mind on the final act, knowing that patience was my weapon. Timing, precision, subtlety, these were the tools of a master. And Frank and Cheryl, they had no idea the stage was already set, the audience waiting, the lights about to shine on every secret they'd thought buried. I leaned back in my chair that night, sipping tea, letting a calm settle over me. The kind of calm that masks a storm. I wasn't just a grandma anymore. I was the puppet master, pulling strings, ready to expose every lie, every deceit. And when it all came crashing down, the world would watch them squirm, and I'd watch quietly, savoring every second. They kept thinking I was confused. They kept thinking old age had finally dulled me. That was their biggest mistake. I learned early that people reveal themselves when they think no one's watching. So I watched. I listened. And then I started to move the chess pieces. First, I tightened the noose without tipping them off. I didn't want a messy confession. I wanted them to confess in front of people, to feel their empire crumble as neighbors watched. So, I began with small, believable lies of my own. White lies that nudged them to the edges. I started with Cheryl. I dropped hints that made her uneasy. A casual remark to a neighbor about a reporter asking questions. A whispered comment about someone spotting a boat near the pier. I didn't give details, just enough to make her look twice at her phone. She bit. She checked messages more. Her hands shook, and she blamed Frank for panic. Their little fights became my advantage. Then, I played Frank. He'd always been cocky. The kind who believed charm could fix anything. I fed that arrogance with an anonymous email suggesting someone had seen a boat matching his. I didn't say who. He panicked quietly, made odd calls, met people in daylight. Those mistakes were gold. I widened my net. I started rifling through small things they left behind. Hotel receipts in trash, coffee cups with lipstick, maps pinned in Frank's garage. The map had dates circled. I photographed everything and kept copies tucked away. This wasn't spite, it was evidence. I used the town to my advantage. Folks here whisper, and a whisper grows fast. I mentioned, casually, to the pastor and the librarian, that a few things about Frank's accident didn't sit right with me. I smiled while I planted curiosity. I volunteered for the bake sale and chatted up the newspaper delivery guy. That man notices comings and goings. He started telling me about cars he remembered parking late. I fed these tidbits back into conversations, so they blossom into gossip. I hired a private investigator through a friend, and asked him to watch who came and went from Cheryl's house. He came back with license plates, late-night meetings, and a man carrying a duffel. I didn't need names yet, just patterns. I slipped the investigator's notes into chat with a neighbor, as if I'd overheard them. Neighbors began to murmur. That murmur would be my chorus. Small. Staged slits helped too. I forgot a charger and then plugged it in for Cheryl, pretending frailty, granting me the moment to check a notification. I found texts I hadn't seen before. Their confidence showed in their words. I removed any obvious traces of my snooping, but saved what I needed. Screenshots, photos, little pieces of proof tucked away in a box under my bed. Then I planted a breadcrumb that would sting. I took one of Frank's old business cards and left it tucked into Cheryl's mail. Later, I mopped the porch, acting frail, and watched her glance at the card with guilty eyes. Evidence piled up. Frank left keys in the coat pocket. I found a motel receipt in the recycling, dated 3 weeks earlier. I pocketed it like a talisman. I recorded conversations, tiny and harmless, into a device in my purse. This was my ledger of truth. I orchestrated moments to raise pressure. I bumped into Cheryl at the grocery and mentioned offhand that someone had seen a man at the harbor. I watched her inhale, like she'd been slapped. I asked Mrs. Lang to casually mention a late-night car she'd noticed. They began to behave like guilty children, distracted and rash. Documentation was everything. Receipts, photos, witness notes, recorded calls. They were the script I would read from when the time came. I rehearsed my performance in the mirror, practiced the tone of the grandmother who'd been hurt but perplexed. Feigned ignorance was an instrument. Used well, it made their panic sing. I didn't plan to drag the police into it first. I wanted spectacle, public exposure, the kind that takes a man apart more thoroughly than any legal sentence. So I chose the annual town fundraiser for the reveal. It would draw the right crowd, people who knew Frank's smile, neighbors who'd invested in kindly memories. When reputations fall, they fall faster in front of witnesses. As the fundraiser drew near, I tightened my web. I placed evidence where it would be found. An extra copy of a photo left in a magazine at the diner. A printed receipt slipped into an envelope that Cheryl found in the laundry. Each finding nudged them closer to the edge without them seeing who pushed. People began to talk louder. Gossip spread like oil on water, and Frank grew sloppy. He began to answer messages with impatience, to say things in whispers that betrayed him when he thought the room was empty. Cheryl's texts turned frantic. Their world, built on careful lies, started to choke on the air I'd been siphoning from it. There was no triumph in my chest when the first neighbor came by with a printed receipt and a trembling voice. There was only a cool, patient satisfaction that justice was aligning itself. I wasn't cruel for the joy of hurting them. I was correcting a theft. They'd stolen 2 years of my life with a fake death, and they deserved to be exposed. My box of evidence rested under my bed, heavy with truth. I would present it with calm, the steady hand of someone who'd been wronged. The town would watch. Frank would face faces full of betrayal. Cheryl would see every friendly smile flip to judgment. They thought they were safe. They thought their secret was buried. They were wrong. I went to sleep the night before the fundraiser, like a woman who had tied the final knot on a rope. My breath was even. My plan was in place. The reveal would be public, theatrical, and irreversible. I wasn't doing this for some petty thrill. I was balancing the scales. And when the house of cards fell, I would slowly stand quietly and watch the pieces scatter. The fundraiser was one of those town things that people pretend not to care about, but show up for anyway. Potatoes on paper plates, a bake sale table bowed under lemon bars, and a choir that sounded like angels stumbling through hymns. I wore my best cardigan and the face that said I was broken but composed. Inside, I was a metronome, slow, deliberate, waiting for the precise beat to pull the curtain. I arrived early and took my place near the refreshments, where I could watch the room without seeming obvious. Folks greeted me like family, offering condolences and clucking about how brave I'd been after Frank's accident. They patted my arm, said the right things. Hell, they even brought casseroles. Nobody suspected I wasn't the woman they thought I was. Cheryl walked in with her head held high, like she was walking a runway instead of a charity hall. Frank followed, the same charming smile plastered on that used-to-be honest face. He moved through the crowd like a practiced shark, shaking hands, making jokes about the weather. People laughed, and my fists curled under the table, like I was holding a secret egg I couldn't let crack. The program started, and the hush fell like a blanket. Reverend Myers took the stage and spoke about community, about honesty, about the ache of loss and the kindness of neighbors. I clapped at the right moments. I let the sermon lay out the perfect architecture for what I'd planned. Words like truth and loss felt like tools in my hands. Midway through, I gave my little speech. I stood, voice soft but steady, and thanked everyone for their support. I told them, in the most grandmotherly way, how lonely it gets when a chair stays empty at dinner. I watched Frank's jaw tighten. He thought maybe I'd break down. He thought maybe I'd beg for answers. He was wrong. Then I let them see the photo, the one of Frank and Cheryl laughing together, projected from my phone onto the big screen behind the stage. I did it with the help of a kindly neighbor who owns a little tech shop. He pretended it was part of a slideshow tribute. The room blinked. The laughter stalled. Faces went slack like animals stunned by bright light. I spoke plainly. I found this photo in a place it shouldn't be, I said. I have reasons to believe some things we were told weren't true. The whispering started like wind in the grass, soft but fast. Frank's smile thinned. Cheryl's lips pressed into a line, like she was holding in a scream. People started to look at them differently. Eyes that once softened at his presence now narrowed. The pastor's throat moved as if he was swallowing something bitter. I felt a satisfaction that was careful, almost clinical. This was not about drama. It was about setting the world straight. I let the slide change, one receipt, then another. I narrated calmly, giving the dates, the tiny details. I didn't point fingers. I laid breadcrumbs of fact. I watched Frank's hands go cold. He shuffled papers, whispered to Cheryl, who looked like someone had pushed her underwater. Gasping for air, someone shouted, "Is this true?" from the back, and the hall turned into a courtroom. I passed around copies of the receipts and photographs I'd collected. People read, murmured, their faces folding into disbelief and quiet fury. The air tasted metallic, like the moment before a storm hits. Frank stumbled for words. He tried to charm, to joke, to tell some half-truth that would soften the blow. But his defenses were thin. Neighborhoods aren't kind to liars when they feel betrayed. We had invested years in believing him, feeding our kids from his generosity, letting him sit at our tables. The betrayal felt personal, like a theft from every neighbor who'd trusted him. Cheryl's face was a mask of shock, and then a flash of anger. I watched her when she mouthed something at Frank. "How dare you?" And he looked back like a cornered animal. I had never seen him like that. His arrogance, which once made him irresistible, looked small now, like a boy caught sneaking cookies. I kept the best card until the end. I told the crowd I had one more thing, a short voicemail saved on Cheryl's phone that explained more than any photo ever could. I played it. A woman's voice, shaky and breathless, came through the speakers. Cheryl, speaking to someone she called Frankie, laughing about how clever they'd been, how they'd pulled it off, how the town never suspected a thing. There was a pause, then Frank's voice in the background saying, "Soon, Margaret will stop asking." The hall felt like it tilted. You could hear a pin drop as everyone stared at them. I watched the color drain from Frank's face. He looked like a man whose life was being taken apart stitch by stitch, and there was nothing he could do to sew it back together. Cheryl's mouth opened and closed. Tears came, then mascara ran, and her bravado collapsed in real time. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. The crowd's reaction did my work for me. Conversations bubbled into accusations. Old friends turned their shoulders. The pastor asked the couple to step outside. I sat down, hands steady, heart calm, and let the town do what towns do. They judged, they whispered, they sided, they recoiled. After the fundraiser, the fallout rippled through our streets like a thrown stone. People I'd waved to in the supermarket stopped meeting my eyes. Some came to my door with casseroles or apologies. Others avoided me like a contagious rumor. Frank and Cheryl were seen arguing at the diner, at the hardware store, in the church parking lot. They started to look smaller, thinner, as if the public shame was consuming their edges. But public humiliation wasn't my only aim. I wanted consequences. I watched the days after the fundraiser with a slow, patient eye. The town had done half my work for me. Whispers circling like crows, but I wasn't finished. Public shame stung them, sure, but I wanted more than humiliation. I wanted them to face consequences that would stick, contracts unraveling, reputations lost, money accounted for. I planned to tighten a legal noose without looking like a vengeful old woman. That required subtlety, patience, and people who could nudge the system without scandal. First, I started with small, official-looking steps. I requested copies of Frank's business records from a state archive under the guise of contesting a municipal tax bill. The clerk, bless him, was helpful. He handed me stacks of forms and ledgers that told a story no one had bothered to read. Numbers didn't lie. They showed transfers, shell companies, and payments made to unfamiliar accounts. My fingers traced lines that linked Frank to entities that smelled like laundering or at least shady bookkeeping. Then I took those pages to an accountant I trusted, a man who owed me a favor from years ago when I'd covered his daughter's tuition. He squinted at the numbers, tapped his pen, and said quietly, "This doesn't add up." He agreed to draft a formal report on potential financial irregularities, the kind of thing that would make auditors sit up and take notice. I didn't accuse him yet. I let the report do the accusing. Meanwhile, Cheryl was behaving as if the world had collapsed. She'd stopped posting on social media, stopped her weekly yoga classes, and started showing up late at work with excuses. I used those absences to my advantage, hiring a legal assistant to pull public records and notices tied to Frank's companies. I fed the assistant small hints, always under the table, so nothing traced back to me. The assistant compiled a packet that read like a crime novel. Shell corporations, invoices to nowhere, payments to unknown recipients. I read it at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug, feeling the slow satisfaction of a plan coming together. I also made sure Frank and Cheryl felt the squeeze socially. I called a few of the people they'd banked on, old friends, business associates, and let conversations steer them toward looking into financials. Some people were reluctant at first. Who wants to accuse someone in town of fraud? But as the receipts of their dishonesty laid themselves bare, a few more voices joined mine. The town's moral outrage started looking less like gossip and more like civic duty. It was important, too, to take the moral high ground. When members of the community asked me if I wanted to press charges, I played the wounded widow gracefully, saying that I wanted truth, not revenge. But behind that genteel mask, I was arranging meetings with lawyers. I met with a local attorney who specialized in corporate malfeasance. He read the packet and said in a low voice, "If these papers check out, you can trigger an audit, or at least freeze accounts until we know more." That's all I needed to hear. I fed the attorney more evidence, piece by piece, letting his curiosity become hunger. He filed confidential requests, subpoenaed bank statements, and quietly opened an inquiry. The inquiry took on a life of its own. Auditors knocked on doors. Banks called, asking awkward questions. Where once Frank signed checks with a flourish, now a bank manager asked for explanations about transfers out of accounts. The landscape was changing. I didn't ignore the personal either. Cheryl hit rock bottom in slow motion. Calls from hospitals with unpaid bills. Employers asking for clarifications about anomalies at work. Neighbors confronting her in the grocery store. She came to me one afternoon, mascara streaked, voice small. "What do you want from me?" she asked, hands twisting in her purse. I looked at her like a woman whose hand had been burned and was stepping back to see if the blister looked infected. "I want the truth," I said, "and I want you to fix what you broke," she sobbed, promising she'd cooperate, that she'd tell the attorneys everything. I let her think she'd survived, that she'd been given a chance. She was desperate, and desperate people lie. So I kept watching. Frank, however, tried a different tactic. He hired a slick lawyer, paid cash, and started doing the rounds. Crisis management meetings, back-channel calls, and a quiet push to discredit anyone who questioned him. He tried to buy silence the way he once bought influence. But money couldn't buy back the trust of every small business owner or neighbor who'd felt betrayed. It couldn't rewind the photo that had flashed on a screen, or the voicemail that had come through loud and clear. As legal pressure mounted, strange little things started to happen to them. Phone lines disconnecting. A vendor, who'd always cut them slack, suddenly demanded payment up front. A bank card declined in a grocery line. I didn't orchestrate every last inconvenience. Some were natural consequences. But I had arranged certain nudges. A banker friend who asked for extra documentation. A former partner who decided now was the time to collect a debt. It was important that the pressure felt real and inexorable, like a tide they couldn't hold back. One afternoon, I received a call from the attorney. "We've got enough to freeze certain accounts pending review," he said. The words landed like snow. I felt a cold satisfaction, but also a strange hollow, because justice on paper isn't the same as the satisfaction of watching them squirm in front of the town. Still, freezing accounts was practical. It prevented them from fleeing with assets while investigations deepened. When the freeze was announced, Frank blustered and raged, televised tantrums, calls to people in power. He accused auditors of vendettas and called the report a witch hunt. But his protests sounded small against a stack of bank statements and signed receipts. People listened, and a few started to nod slowly, as if pieces finally fit into a picture they hadn't wanted to see. I kept my distance in public. I let the legal machinery churn while I tended to the quieter part of what needed to be done. There were things a courtroom wouldn't fix. The betrayal. The nights I'd cried into a pillow. The years of pretense. Those aches needed closure of a different kind, and I planned them carefully. I kept one final, devastating move planned. By the time I arrived at the 6th week after the fundraiser, Frank and Cheryl were already fraying at the edges. I'd see it in their eyes when I passed them at the grocery store, in the whispered phone calls that ended abruptly when I came into view, in the restless pacing of Frank's hands whenever he thought no one was watching. They didn't know what hit them, and that was the beauty of it. I didn't make mistakes. I didn't let emotion dictate my moves. Every step was measured. I spent mornings analyzing my evidence, afternoons planting subtle psychological triggers, and evenings observing their reactions from a distance. Every phone call I intercepted, every message I photographed, added a brick to the cage I was building around them. It started with a simple text I sent anonymously to Cheryl. "You're running out of time. He knows you better than you think." I didn't need to say who he was. She instantly assumed it was Frank. Her replies were frantic, filled with typos and half-thought sentences. I kept my voice calm, my identity hidden. Frank started acting defensively in public. He checked the locks twice, avoided the marina, and grew paranoid about who was watching him. He even started looking over his shoulder when he walked through town. Every slip he made, every twitch in his posture, I noted and filed away in my mental ledger. Patience, I reminded myself. Timing was everything. Then I made my move. I sent a tip to the local newspaper under a pseudonym, hinting at inconsistencies in Frank's accident and a possible ongoing deception. I didn't need the story to run immediately. I just needed it to rattle them, to make the walls of their carefully constructed lie tremble. And it did. Within a few hours, Frank's calls were clipped, Cheryl's texts frantic. They were both sweating without knowing exactly why. I used that tension to my advantage. I invited Cheryl to what I framed as a family lunch at my home. She walked in cautiously, scanning the room as if expecting traps. I greeted her warmly, hugged her even, played the loving mother-in-law role with perfection. Every second I held her in that space. She was forced to breathe my air, hear my voice, and realize she wasn't in control anymore. I left subtle reminders around the house. A printed bank statement here, a photo tucked into a magazine there, all obvious enough to be noticed, but innocuous enough to seem coincidental. Cheryl found them, and immediately assumed Frank had made mistakes. Exactly what I wanted. I smiled quietly to myself from the kitchen as she scrambled, paper in hand, muttering apologies and frantic exclamations. Frank, meanwhile, was being cornered elsewhere. I contacted a few of his old business partners, mentioning in casual conversation that a review of old accounts might be coming. They called auditors, asked questions, and double-checked transactions. Every call, every inquiry, tightened the web. Frank's empire was beginning to wobble, and he didn't even know why. I had my final psychological play mapped out for the big reveal. I staged it carefully for maximum impact. I invited a few town leaders and mutual friends to my home under the guise of a casual tea. Nothing formal, just old neighbors catching up. Cheryl and Frank would arrive separately, of course, under the assumption that it was all friendly. They would find themselves trapped in a room full of witnesses when the truth was finally laid bare. I took my time preparing. I made sure all evidence was visible but not yet explained. Receipts, messages, photographs, arranged neatly on the table, almost like a still life painting. I rehearsed what I would say, my tone calm and measured, my body language conveying authority and composure. I wanted them to feel small, without my raising my voice. The day arrived. I greeted guests as they came, smiling, serving tea, chatting. Frank arrived first, trying to mask nervousness with charm. He didn't see the subtle glances I exchanged with certain guests, the way people quietly murmured and glanced at each other. Cheryl followed, hesitating at the door, glancing at Frank, then at me, then at the room. Her face went pale. I asked them both to sit. I began speaking softly, carefully laying out the sequence of events, letting my words flow like a calm stream that was slowly eroding the dam. I recounted small inconsistencies they had left behind, coincidences that weren't coincidences at all. I showed photographs and messages without commentary at first. The room was quiet. The tension was palpable. Then, I brought out the final piece, a recorded message from Cheryl's own phone. I played it softly at first, letting the words sink in. Cheryl's eyes widened, her hands trembling. Frank's jaw tightened. I spoke clearly, methodically, pointing out how every lie had been catalogued, how every misstep had been noted. I didn't need to yell. The evidence spoke for itself. By the time I finished, the room had gone still. Everyone looked at them differently now. Judgment, disbelief, and awe mixed in their gazes. Frank and Cheryl sat frozen, realizing for the first time that their entire world, the lies they had built for years, had crumbled. They were exposed, helpless in the glare of truth. I finally leaned back in my chair, calm as ever, and let silence fill the room. It was delicious, the kind of quiet that follows a storm. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't hit anyone, but I had won. They had underestimated me. They had thought my age and seeming frailty made me weak. And now they knew, too late, just how wrong they were. The room was still, heavy with disbelief and tension. Frank and Cheryl sat frozen, their faces pale, their hands twisting in laps or fidgeting nervously. Every whisper, every glance from the neighbors, every pointed look from old friends had already begun to unravel them. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. I rose from my chair slowly, deliberately, calm as the eye of a hurricane. I looked at Frank first, letting my gaze linger. You told us all you were gone, I said softly. But you weren't. You played us for fools. Thought I'd never figure it out. My voice didn't tremble. Every word was measured, deliberate. Every pause, a tiny hammer striking the wall of their confidence. Then I turned to Cheryl, still clutching her hands together like a child caught in the middle of a storm. And you, I said, you thought you could steal what was mine, live in the shadow of lies, and no one would ever notice. But someone did notice. I noticed. I let the silence hang, thick and suffocating. I didn't need to shout. The tension in the room did my work. Guests shifted, some leaning in, others looking away, unable to meet the eyes of the guilty. The effect was electric. Every eye in the room turned to Frank and Cheryl, as if the weight of the town itself pressed down on them. Then came the pièce de résistance. I had collected everything, messages, photos, receipts, recordings, and now I displayed them on the table in plain sight. I didn't accuse. I didn't yell. I let the evidence speak. I told them calmly. Everything you tried to hide, every lie you told, every trick you thought would protect you, it's all here. Frank tried to speak, tried to charm, tried to dismiss, but I cut him off with a look that froze him mid-word. You has nothing left, I said, voice calm but cold, surgical. No excuses, no lies that will work here. Cheryl's face twisted, her carefully constructed mask of confidence shattered. She reached for a small protest, but her voice caught in her throat. Guests murmured quietly, the whispers spreading like wildfire. Every neighbor who had believed, every friend who had stayed neutral until now bore witness to their deception. I watched carefully as panic started to rise like smoke from a hidden fire. I had built every step to this moment. Subtle hints, evidence planted, messages leaked. Every mistake they had made over the last few weeks, every misstep they thought was hidden, led them straight here. And here they were, exposed, cornered, and helpless. Then I revealed the last piece. Frank had been living under a false identity all along, renting that marina unit, keeping Cheryl close, hiding from anyone who might expose him. I produced a series of photos I had obtained. Him entering the storage unit, leaving with her, their car parked secretly near town events. I didn't speak much. I let the images do the talking. Faces went pale, hands clutched at tables, whispers turned to gasps. I leaned back and let a slow smile cross my face. Calm, cold, unstoppable. You thought you were clever. You thought I was gone, but I wasn't. And now, I paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. You're going to live with what you created. Every lie, every betrayal, every deceit, it's your burden now. Frank tried one last, desperate attempt to regain control. He raised his voice, tried to shift blame, tried to claim misunderstanding. I held up a hand. No, I said simply. Not here. Not with everyone watching. You had your chance to be honest. You chose lies. Now everyone knows the truth. Cheryl broke first. Tears rolled down her cheeks, mascara streaking across her face. She whispered apologies, begged for understanding, tried to make the damage smaller. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The damage was already done. They were trapped, fully exposed. The satisfaction I felt wasn't cruel. It was measured, precise. Revenge wasn't about fury. It was about justice, about correcting a wrong with elegance and certainty. Watching them squirm while the town bore witness was my final performance. And they performed beautifully, exactly as I had hoped. Then I let them leave, slowly, humiliated, shoulders slumped, the weight of every secret pressing down. I walked them to the door, smiled kindly, and whispered, "Remember this lesson. Nothing stays hidden forever." They didn't respond. They couldn't. Their world had collapsed quietly, inexorably, and there was nothing left to say. After they left, I sank into my favorite chair and poured myself a cup of tea. The calm that settled over me was complete. The storm outside fading into a gentle breeze. I had done what I set out to do. My mind wandered over the weeks of careful planning, the patience, the psychological play, and I allowed myself a small, private smile. I had won. Not with brute force, not with anger, but with patience, intelligence, and the unshakable certainty that truth always comes to light. I picked up the phone and typed a short message to a trusted friend. It's done. Justice served quietly, but thoroughly. Then I added a line to my viewers, as I always did. Hit that subscribe button if you love a story of clever revenge, and please comment the city you're watching from. I want to see where this story traveled. Sitting there in the quiet, I felt complete. Frank and Cheryl would rebuild. Yes, maybe claw their way back to some semblance of life. But they would never forget. Every smile they gave in public, every handshake, every casual conversation would carry the memory of this day. And I would continue my life, calm, unshaken, and wiser. The chair at my kitchen table was empty no longer. My peace had returned. Because sometimes, the dead don't need to haunt. Sometimes, the living just need to see justice served, and that's exactly what I did.